Hi guys, and welcome back. I'm Nikki Fogden-Moore. This is Radical Self-Belief, the Mojo Maker podcast and YouTube channel. It's been a hot minute. We're now in 2022. Can you believe it? Heading into season 4 of the show. If you haven't already liked and subscribed, moving over from the original platform, we've now got new show links. You can find out more on nikkifogdenmoore.com, or you can follow, subscribe, like. We'd love your feedback on all podcast platforms, of course. And before I get into introducing the hot seat guest for today's show, I want to remind you that your topics and comments we take really seriously in terms of what you want to hear about. This is not going to be just a conversation that has you dipping off and falling asleep halfway through. We want you to take away 1, 2, or 3 main points that can have some radical impact on tiny habits you can change for a sustainable future. And also there's always show notes and links to this episode where you can find out more about my guests and special offers for book and the new Radical Self-Belief online program. So without further ado, I have one of my favorite all-time humans on the planet. It's not very often that you get to meet someone that founds an integrated energy, oil and gas company along with their wife and has kept a team of around 35 staff, which is incredibly boutique for the type of production operation they have. So I'd like to welcome CEO and founder of Bridgeport Energy, Chris Way, here live in his hot seat from Sydney as I'm sitting up here virtually, socially distancing in Noosa. Chris, welcome.
Well, thank you, Nikki. How's the surf up there?
Well, it's been pretty manic up here. We've had that massive cyclone run through, so we've had big swell, some pretty horrific weather. I think this is the first day in 2 weeks we haven't had rain, Chris.
Yeah, well, it's been our way as well. We've had quite a bit down this way, so the surf's been good, and it's been a relatively relaxing Christmas, except, of course, the COVID outbreak, that the Omicron variant that's hurting us badly. But
yeah. Well, part of the landscape.
I hope it's not another year. I was in my diary the other day and realized that I started a file called COVID, my email. I started a file called COVID, and it started 2020, and now here we are in the 3rd year. So it's been persistent.
It is, and I think, it's just part of our lives at the moment, so we have to focus on what we can make the most of. And one of those good stories that I'm, thrilled to be bringing a little bit more to a more general audience is the great aspect of what I call the business of energy and integrated energy, something at Bridgeport that's not very often you get to see under the hood or behind the scenes with energy companies creating oil and gas. We have a lot of stigma around it. A lot of pictures come to mind. We talk about oil and gas, and one of the things that I've loved with working with you for the past decade is that you actually practice what you preach, and there's a good feel-good story about what's happening for sustainable energy practices that will have us in a much better position if we're all prepared to do the right thing. So, Chris, before we dive in, I think it'd be really interesting to give our listeners and viewers just your elevator introduction to the fact that not only did you found an oil and gas company along with your wife in 2008, you're an avid sailor, a world champion sailor, and you've been in this industry way back when from grassroots. So give us a couple of points of your CV of why on earth something motivated you to set up an oil and gas company and you decided to do that here in Australia.
Well, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, it's an interesting proposition to start an energy company. I guess it comes from the depth of having worked in it for now 40 years. You don't get the credentials to start an energy company like this, where we produce oil and gas and water as part of that, and manage that environmental situation without having had the depth of working for some of the majors. I've worked for Esso and in Australia. Quite a few of the smaller end entities. Some got quite large, like Amperex, which was bought by Mobil in the late 90s, and then Rock Oil, which was the one company I worked for with a very well-renowned CEO, John Doran, who was well-known in the industry and a real entrepreneur. And if you will, I understudied with him, and we developed some fields offshore WA, worked internationally in West Africa and UK. And I guess that just set me up for what became natural at the end of Rock Oil when they were bought by an Austrian oil company to start this business. And we started it with a different plan, though. And I think that's starting to come to fruition now.
And I think that is just a really great point to drop the pin on. The plan was you started it with a different vision, and your wife is a geologist. You've always your whole family's into sustainability, the planet. We've always got on that main point of making sure that we looked after and nurtured everything. So the three things that we started working on together in the discussion was investment, integrity, and integrated energy approach, because normally now, even when you look at putting super managed funds or stocks and shares and investing, everyone wants to shy away from the bad oil and gas, energy, coal, everything else, so it's really got a rap from, spills and everything else and things that have gone wrong. And there hasn't been a lot of light shed on the fact that whilst we want to avoid having anything to do with said banned type of companies, there's actually a lot of good that's happening in the industry to pour back into the environment, back into communities, and to working, as you say, with water distillation, getting crops and things back for farmers, sharing a better sustainable approach, and doing the right thing as a business. Why do you think it's so hard to get that message across that companies like yourself actually are practicing what they preach and are doing the right thing?
I think it's hard to put your finger on it exactly, but I think a lot of it stems from possibly a reduced capacity for science. There's so much coming at us from every corner that without a degree in science of some sort, or some definitely post high school training, everything that comes at you, you have to believe, because Google's always right, and there's for every conversation there's an alternate conversation. So the oil industry hasn't done itself any favors. The oil and gas industry, and laterally the gas industry has started to improve. We're part of that gas industry as well, so it's all really for us one business, whether you're Santos, Woodside, Exxon, BP, but we're all moving towards gas away from oil, and I can explain that shortly. But the fundamental problem is that over the years, right since the Exxon Valdez, which ran aground 4 decades ago in Alaska, polluting that environment, that the tendency of oil companies has been to push it on any disaster underneath the table. That's not unusual. You saw that with Qantas when they had that problem with the first the Airbus 380, when the piece fell off that and they almost crashed that plane. And that was, there's a lot of cover up that does happen. And it happens because, companies don't want to lose their brand. So Exxon didn't want to lose their brand when the Valdez went aground and spilled in Alaska, but in the end they lost complete brand recognition because of that. So I think companies now are more aware of their brand, and the social media allows reporting of events before even the company often knows about it. Qantas was a classic with the Airbus 380. The social media knew before their own operations manager in Melbourne knew they had a problem. Similarly with the disaster, the Macondo disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, that was all known by social media before it was known even by the company, and a disaster response could occur. So we've been our own worst enemy. We have roughly every 10 years, hopefully not into the future, but roughly every 10 years, the industry has a major event, and that puts bad light on what we do. The basic product, however, is necessary to everyday life. It's as necessary as the iron ore that Fortescue mines, and as necessary as the copper that BHP mines.
So just to pause you on that, let's just give a bit of context around, one of the things we talk about the fact, yes, it's even like COVID with the vaccines at the moment. Nobody really knows all the information because we're not doctors, we're not scientists. We have to rely on what's being fed to us. One of the things that we did in the recent video, we went out back west into, where a lot of the inland plants are, the oil and gas plants, one of them being the most original one in Australia, is the real life contribution that you're making to regenerate existing resources and hardware, giving back into the communities, and then the battle that you have to actually show that you're doing the right thing and getting people to believe it. So the context is that we are still using iron ore, petroleum products, even in wetsuits and other things. Our everyday lives require this oil and gas production. So what happens for me to go and tank up my car? Even, we'll talk about the electric vehicle discussion on part 2, but just take a listener and a viewer through, in a very short way, the journey, the fact that even by listening to this, our computers, everything is made up from a byproduct of these very core materials and minerals that are coming from the earth.
That's right. And I really encourage viewers to read a lot of Attenborough's books, particularly his most recent one, which is his statement on probably his end of life statement on the state of the planet. And we need to be informed by people such as that, who are well known. And you'll find in that indeed he is a proponent of fossil fuels until such time as we can get beyond fossil fuels, and we know that transition can take a long time. But just to explain how the fossil fuel game works, in periods when there's been high CO2 in the atmosphere, we've had a lot of plant growth. Those plants die; they become ultimately fossils and generate hydrocarbons in that process as the plant materials, typically on or onshore. I'm talking onshore because that's where we are, but offshore in a marine environment, same idea. All the plankton and everything settles to and other marine detritus settles to the bottom of the seabed, and then over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, scales that we can't even imagine in our own mind, that becomes pressured and turns into a hydrocarbon and oil. I don't have a sample in my office here, but
you're gonna go behind you and grab a fossil. So So we could put some images up in the thing. So these are part of the Earth's surface.
So in the Jurassic period, you've all seen Jurassic Park as an example. That's one period that we can produce oil from. We drill wells now that Jurassic period rock is buried at depth where we are. It could be 2,000 to 3,000 meters. We drill down, we tap into that reservoir, and we pull that oil out of the ground. Now that sounds like a simple process, but you're managing pressure and temperature and volatility. So hence fires, explosions can be and have been a real risk historically in the oil and gas business. Much less so today because of technology, but certainly in the early days of the oil business, a lot of famous blowouts where pieces of pipe blow out in the air and fires in the Middle East. So that's your oil production side.
When you're talking about oil production, I know how people are going to listen to this and they say, drilling into the Earth's surface and, there's an immediate, metaphorical response and reaction to raping and pillaging the Earth and blowing things up. And now we've got certain seismic testing that is interrupting whale breeding grounds, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got an issue of perception at the moment. And I think when you talk about finding the crude, finding the oil, finding the source of the gas, the one thing I want to focus on is your environmental commitment as a company was quite astounding when I was out there on limiting the footprint of extracting, finding, and sourcing those materials, and then keeping that in a nurturing way. We have a barren images that are presented to us of the pumps, right, across many, many countries. But what I noticed with Bridgeport is that I went to your sites and it was full of plants and cows grazing, and it was a very integrated approach. So when you talk about that blowing things up, it turns people off. And I think that the purpose of this discussion is, and then we'll put pictures with this, is to show these new ways to do things now.
So let's go back in history, because I always find that history doesn't repeat, but it does give us a chance to see how the world, how the society has responded to its energy needs, and that is the business of energy. So before the oil industry in 1837, I'm sure your readers know, but what was the principal source of energy for lights in Boston and Europe?
Wasn't that like whales? What was that? I think it was whale oil, wasn't it? That's why we had this terrible harvesting of, and now they're coming back, of course, of whales. So that was the original source of energy consumption, was the whaling industry.
Yep. So the Industrial Revolution began with coal. Coal mining was used to manufacture stuff, but in terms of light in the streets of Boston or the streets of London, it was whale oil. And 1837, the first oil, underground oil, was found in Pennsylvania. And that began a trajectory of change for the oil and gas industry. The neonatal energy game, which you drill into the ground and you found oil and it was free. Nobody understood environmental impacts whatsoever. There was never, it was, hey, here's this free oil in the ground. Let's turn it in instead of buying whale oil. And interestingly, we see also during that time, if you watch the Moby Dick movie, you'll find that there was an OPEC equivalent in Boston that was controlling the price of whale oil. And so we see that today where OPEC controls the price of oil because they control the majority of production in the world. Out of 100 million barrels a day, they represent about 15% of that on any given day, OPEC, maybe up to 20 to 30 at other periods. So they control the market the same as the Boston traders controlled the whale oil market back in the 1800s. Now, the next question is, how long did it take for whale oil to disappear, for whaling as an industrial commodity? Ignore Japan's efforts today to convince their population that they should be eating whale flesh. Let's ignore that. How long did it take for industrial whaling to stop?
Well, you're asking the wrong person here because I'm terrible at history.
The answer is 100 years. I mean, 1930s was when, and in fact, it was even later than that, because I can remember growing up in Eastern Canada, going with my grandfather down to the coast where there was whaling areas, and they still appalled me at 7 years old. So that would have been in the early 60s, seeing that. Like, it's still an image in my mind of this whale being pulled up by the tail and the blood and the guts and the whole thing. It was just, and so that was in Eastern Canada. Argentina only just shut down whaling as an industrial support in the like 5-6 years ago. Don't quote me on that date, but and Japan still tries to get its population to eat it. So God knows why. So the bottom line is that to transition out takes a long time. Now, you could argue that we're smarter than we were in the 1800s. However,
I think I'm going to leave that comment just over there. Maybe in some areas, maybe not all, but
well, I think the other part of that, though, is that since the 1800s, the population has now grown to be 8 billion from 500 million or a billion. I'd have to look back to see what the population was in 1830. So scale becomes your problem again. There was never a sustainable pathway for whale oil. There's never going to be a long-term sustainable pathway for oil and gas because it's extractive. We run the same risk on iron ore. We run the same risk on copper.
And that's basically why we're on the show today, is to talk about the fact that there has to be an integrated approach, an overlap. And this is one of the things when you started the company in 2008, and something we've been trying to get through in the messaging, a lot of the more scientific discussions we've been having, is what are the practical ways that we bring to life and look under the hood in integrated flow. We can't just turn the switches off and say, right, once we've restored everything, then the power comes back on, because people still want to get their food, their vegetables, they still want to fly to Tahiti, they still want to do all these things. So we must all look at a integrated approach, which is progress, not perfection. And that means balancing awareness with integrity for operations and the requirements of our energy based on this population, which is exactly what at Bridgeport you're doing with the integrated approach. Could you give a couple of examples of what integrated energy looks like on an operational perspective from Bridgeport, such as the fact that water is part of the productivity in your operations?
Yeah, so I've long held that water shortage in the world is going to become more and more of a crisis as we enter the 30s, 40s, 2030s and 40s, and that's a population function, whether it's potable water or water for cropping. We're struggling to meet the planet's food needs today, let alone where we'll be in 15 years. Hence the advent of lab-grown meats and alternative vegan products, which, we know that vegan products use less waters. But that's not what our business is about. Our business was always about buying, and started with buying older oil fields and repurposing them. So how do we repurpose them? We bring them back to life to make production, because we need to live off cash flow. So our earnings for our business come from oil today. We've also had an exploration portfolio where we're looking for the next product of the future, which is gas. Now, gas has been around for a long time, but not as long as oil, and it's probably not as versatile as oil. Gas is more of a town gas supply, like whale oil was the town light supply. Gas becomes more of a town gas supply for your cookstops and whatnot, and for electricity generation. It's highly wasteful on electricity generation. There should be something better for electricity generation, because we will run out of gas eventually. So gas but it is a cleaner burning fuel. So as we go up from coal to oil to gas to nuclear, we go from the carbon output goes down to zero with nuclear and renewables.
And one of the things that is really interesting, like for example at Mooney, which is one of the outback Queensland plants you have, is that you've got one of the original plants, oil plants in Australia, and all the original hardware is there. But as a company, you have a mission to reutilize the pipes, the systems, the whole...
That's right. We have some of the oldest generators in the country, London diesel, for example.
Yeah, and I've got photos of this. I'll put the video and all the photos up. But this is the point, Chris. We're having a conversation around a huge contentious issue where everyone wants to get on their soapbox and say how terrible it is, but I don't believe we're shedding light on the good things that companies like yourself are trying to do in the interim to make sure that we can still turn our lights on. We can still have social media talk about how bad it all is. So we need to turn everything around and really show, for example, the ponds. So the fact that extracting water out through the process of creating the oil ready to use that gets transported for us to actually use in our day-to-day lives. We've got these beautiful big ponds, and those ponds are full of crystal clear water with wildlife on them. And we want to ensure that farmers know that water is pure and ready to use for stock, for livestock and everything else. But how do we make sure that your message gets across, that the water that is being distilled and utilized through that process is actually something that can go back into communities?
Yeah, so good question. I mean, just to explain again to your listeners how the oil works. Oil and water reside together at depth, so that water comes out with the oil. And right now we're producing roughly 80% oil and 20% oil, 80% water, and sometimes up to 90% water in both our fields. So that water is left to evaporate in ponds. That was historically what happened. I've seen that for the last 10 years as a waste of a resource. It's coming from underground. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. It just needs to be cleaned up with regard to stripping chlorides out of it, salts, for those who want to know what a chloride is. And so that clean water can be then used, and is used today, for stock watering out west, particularly in drought periods. Western fields out near Eromanga and Quilpie, we provide water to the landowner, and that helps keep their stock alive through the drought period. Either that, or they destock all the way to the east, and that's a hugely expensive proposition for them. There's some out there that would say we shouldn't be watering cattle because meat should be shut down, but unfortunately that debate is coming along well behind where the oil and gas industry finds itself today. And by providing that water to the community, to a business that's growing cattle, then that's a viable outcome. The other thing that we're doing, which is getting a solar driven distillation process rather than the membrane driven, which is like the filter in your house. We're using a solar distillation methodology that we're just we brought in from Florida, 37 meters, so 100-foot long solar array that will take the produced water through a vacuum tube and then turn that into distilled water for potable water. So this is pure water. It's actually not drinkable. You have to actually add fluoride back, like the Sydney water does for us here, or neutral water.
That's another myth, isn't it? Everyone says they want pure water, but that will actually kill you if you drink pure.
Right. Yeah, distilled water is not potable for long.
Yeah, exactly. What, I just drew this little diagram as you're talking. I call this the sweet spot. Like, this is utopia, right? This is where we all want to be. And that's why I love working. And even BP, BHP, Santos, like everyone in the industry, we all want utopia. As humans, we want utopia.
And my wife's down at our cottage called Utopia. So
So what I'm trying to do by bringing this discussion up with you is talking about the sweet spot, which is, the horrendous way we used to do things, and declining the harmful, degenerative, misinformed because we didn't know, and realizing that there's a lot of knowledge now that is bringing a regeneration, a reintegration, an opportunity, and a linear approach to utopia. We can't, you can't just turn something off. It's like getting fit and healthy. I've started running again, and I don't know if you saw, I had a snake in my yoga mat. That was my motivation. But you can't just go from zero to hero. You have to have steps in place. So one of the things that I want to do with you, Chris, is create a bit of a linear approach where we put some things in and we actually create a picture in people's heads that the sweet spot does exist. And we're actually right in the middle of it, I think, now, listening to, a lot of the energy companies that I talk to and yourselves, is it might not be perfect, but we're working towards an integrated approach, which is we can't give up where we're at, and we can't go back. No. But what we are doing is using science and community and integrity to do the right thing as much as we can.
Absolutely. And, I think the first thing to understand is that what society will take and won't take. And to go back to history, let's remember the 1973 oil shock, when people were shooting others in the lineup to get coupons so they could fill their car. Because frankly, what's more important, the 2-rack tractor going to take the kids to school, or the courier that needs to put food on his plate? And that becomes a societal decision when there's an energy crisis. Google 1973 oil shock. Look at the shocking pictures in New York City, people being held at gunpoint to get coupons so they could fill their cars. And that's where we'll end up if we turn off oil today. We're going to end up with people deciding that their delivery of their children to school is more important than the delivery of the courier that's going to get paid to put food on the table. So, those are the choices that we end up putting ourselves into with the oil crisis, and we don't want that.
Well, I think
that's a fundamental society need, is energy.
We've got a fundamental society need of bridging the gap with energy, which is, but we've also got a couple of other historical things here in Australia, such as the blackouts in Adelaide, and the fact that a lot of our original generators and backup facilities were shut down completely, not maintained or functional, because we can't just rely on one thing or two things. So an integrated approach to energy, and what you're saying with the FDU unit, with making farmers, communities more aware that instead of letting water evaporate from oil production that is going to happen whether we like it or not, because you want to drive somewhere. We can't all ride horses over to West Australia. You can't fly to see your relatives. But as a conscious person who loves the environment, I'm very interested in supporting companies who are doing the right thing, such as Bridgeport, and making sure that we give two sides of the story in media now that show, while we take out 20% oil, 80% of the water that comes from that process can be booked back into our communities.
And I should say the third thing that we're looking at with that water is taking the distilled water, which has got nothing in it, not potable, and turning that into into hydrogen using electrolyzers and solar power. So, hydrogen becomes, if I go down that carbon pathway again, where coal's up in the left, high carbon footprint, with nuclear at the bottom with zero, hydrogen also is at zero.
Yeah.
Hydrogen has no carbon footprint. It can have carbon footprint in manufacturing it if you make it from methane, but when you make it from water, it doesn't have an associated methane, so associated carbon footprint. So that's the difference between what they call blue hydrogen, which is coming from methane, and green hydrogen, which is coming from pure water. Now, you got to be careful too, because green hydrogen isn't all green. If it's going to take you 6,000 acres of solar panels to make this, how are you going to argue that that's actually green? We're going to be using solar panels. So we're going to be calling it green, but we actually, the footprint to make those 6,000 acres of panels to mine the lithium, or not to, well, for using batteries, lithium, but to mine the graphite and the carbon to be able to make the panels, the glass, the plastics, all takes a footprint. So we have to be careful when we talk about what's green and what isn't green.
Yeah.
Even renewables isn't green. A nuclear power plant isn't green because all the steel and products that have had to go into making that are going to have an oil-based or carbon-based footprint. We just haven't got an answer yet for all the mining. And I think the other thing, if I could just let people know that out of the 100 million barrels a day that we produce, and there's 158 liters in a barrel, so you run the maths, it's big numbers.
You're talking
per day.
Globally. Are you taking globally?
Globally.
Yep. I just wanted to put that in globally. Yep.
Globally, 100 million barrels a day. About 1/3 of it goes to passenger, I call it heavy fuel. So diesel
planes,
for planes, for vessels on the sea that transport your online products, for jet craft that transport your online products and passengers and so forth. About 15% goes into passenger vehicles, and that's where we're, so far out of that 15%, about 1% is take up for EVs. So it's a very small part. It's growing, and we want to see EVs on the road, but not if they're going to be driven off coal-fired power plants.
Well, and also, I mean, that's why I said we need to do part 2 of this discussion, because we want to talk about electric vehicles, batteries, recharging. The new technology coming out of China now, where you get a 500,000 kilometers out of one battery. All sorts of things. The electric vehicle graveyard in France, XYZ. So I just want to take that and pop that over for episode 2. But what I do want to talk about is our search for utopia, and the fact that if you're listening to this and your mind's already got so confused, that's the whole point. Is that no matter where you look, you will end up confused, because there is no exact science to the sweet spot right now. But what we need to remember is that there is a determined progress. There are steps in place where there is an integrated approach to energy, whether it's oil, gas, hydrogen, and all of that will rely on a multiple of energy supply sources, whether it's extraction as well as using energy from the sun. We have to have a collective and integrated approach to energy, which is what Bridgeport Energy are doing, even down to the fact of how you set up your inland sites, the low footprint, and we'll provide photos for all of this. But the awareness of the other thing is, if people really like this discussion, if we were to go on the Bridgeport Energy website, everything else, because of how everything's set up right now, you can't actually fact find too much around this infogram. So maybe we should create something, Chris, which kind of denotes this linear approach to utopia. And create something together.
I get approached daily by marketing companies, and we don't market because our crude gets sold to BP in Singapore, or in Australia. Our Australian crude for the outback that we operate goes to IOR, which is a locally based refinery in Eromanga. So why would I market? I think what oil companies are starting to realize now that they do need to market how their product is used for good. And we need to be all working towards the use of our produced water for hydrogen. As to how we drive the energy intensive electrolyzers that will change that water from H2O to just hydrogen and put out oxygen as part of that stream. That's the debate. Do we put in 6,000 acres of panels? Do we put in gas-driven turbines to make that energy? I guess at the end of the day, we that's what's challenging industry today, is continuing to be able to generate that level of power that's needed. And then the other thing that I'm encouraging everybody right now to get solar panels on their roofs, because the more you can do to reduce your footprint of energy consumption from the grid, the better. Now, you don't have to go the full hog and put $10,000 worth of Tesla batteries in. That's up to your own personal view of lithium batteries and their life and cost. But really, this isn't to put solar panels on your roof to be able to have cheaper, lower demand power during the day is probably a good thing, because it's forcing the generators to come up with a plan. That plan could be everything from large scale batteries to retaining some of the spinning power that sits in coal-fired power plants today. But we also need to, I guess the challenge for your listeners is to say, if you could have a coal-fired power plant, what's that utopia? And to me, that utopia is one where it makes no CO2. And that's feasible today. We can, low emission coal-fired generators are feasible. Coal is in so much abundance that we've got 500-600 years of supply, and so if we can put sequestration sites underneath those coal-fired power plants or nearby, then, and that becomes a commitment by those generators to be able to continue to provide supply, the same way as you should be demanding that the Coles and Woolies don't plastic coat the plastic, don't put all the veggies in plastics. It's your societal choice. So if you could have a zero CO2 output coal-fired power plant, that's where we should also be going. We can use that, and we can sequester that CO2 forever.
Yeah,
that's what we do. We put things underground. So
I think
that's another area we're working on.
And I think the thing that, the dichotomy that you have when you're so inside this industry, is that your internal heartbeat is all the details, the information, and you can go down into the minutia of everything. But some of these words, people just get lost. They're like, does that mean I can start my car in the morning, and can I turn my computer on? Or I want to have.
I think if you're driving an electric car, you want to think twice about where the power to that plug comes from.
Well, exactly.
If that comes in Queensland from coal-fired power plants, then you're kidding yourself. If it comes in South Australia from solar arrays, then probably wiser to drive an EV. Here in New South Wales, we're half and half,
And so what I'd like to do is, with your permission, first of all, provide a connection that maybe people can have a conversation with you on LinkedIn, and we can get more of a dialogue. Or perhaps if you're listening to this and we've just sparked enough interest, because we've thrown a lot of information at you guys, for you to go, well, hold on a second, I thought it was like this, but it sounds like there's so many integrated approaches and things that are happening right now. I want to know more. Leave us your questions, drop them under YouTube in the comments, email Nikki at nikkifogden-moore.com, drop it in the blog comments. I don't mind. Chris and I will provide a way to get back to you. And if you want to have a conversation with Chris as the CEO of the company, then go onto LinkedIn and connect with Chris Way there. I will put his details there, Chris, but I just want this to be the beginning, to set the scene, to say that all hope is not lost. In fact, quite the contrary. And that's why I love working with visionary leaders like yourself. Most often or not, 100% of the people I work with are so busy doing the job well that they're not out in the public eye. They're not talking about it because you're busy worrying about how to put food back on society's table in generations to come, how to make sure that we have wildlife roaming free in this planet. As a fan of David Attenborough and the beautiful series on Netflix at the moment, Our Planet as well, there are so many options. But if we decide to focus on what has gone wrong, then we don't have the energy to focus on what's happening that's going right. And this is a great example with Bridgeport Energy of what is going right, with a small team of 35 employees that are all so vested in the longevity of this planet. The fact that you've got the same staff that have been there a decade, from the bones of the business right through to celebrating 12 years, is a testimony to you in your hard times. I know that we often laugh and say that there's a lot of Calvinism going on in the leadership there, but I think that true grit, determination, and rolling your sleeves up approach is what's given the longevity and the tenacity for Bridgeport to survive unprecedented times and be a beacon in the business of energy on how integrated approaches are happening. It's just that we don't hear about it. So if you want to hear from Chris and ask us your questions, we would welcome that. We'd welcome an open debate to talk about hydrogen, to talk about the FDU unit, how actually we can use more plants, hardware, and existing facilities for better reasons and resources now, the difference between coal, oil, and gas, why we need a different approach, and if you do want to do solar, how to make good decisions around what is the impact and the footprint of that, and how you can get involved in being part of Utopia as well. So Chris, one sweet spot comment, what's one thing you're most proud of at the moment that Bridgeport as a team really showcase inside an industry that has been battered and bruised and trying to claw its way back to show that everything, the money that, BP and BHP have to pour back into doing the right thing is also a very interesting discussion, because a lot of people that say you should be doing the right thing don't have the cash flow and the reserves to actually create a bigger footprint on the right thing. So whilst the footprint for what was wrong was there, companies that do have the cash flow are spending on doing the right thing. Would you agree with that statement?
100%. There's no companies in this country or in non-third world countries that are not doing the right thing. We can't attract employees if we don't do the right thing, and that's a selfish statement, but it's a reality. If you want a good mechanical engineer, you want a good geologist, you better have an ESG, environmental social governance plan. We think ours is second to none. I'm sure BP thinks theirs is second to none as well. I wouldn't ever put myself on the same stage as them because we don't have the capital to do what they do, but in our own small way, we're innovative. And I think that's what's made me most proud of this group, is how innovative the team has been, from Barry and Lorna through to Cam and our ops team headed by Brian. So I think that team is really embraced because they really believe in the change. The other thing I think I haven't actually talked to you about this, but COP26 last year came out with some very good initiatives around investing in carbon credits. And I think your listeners as investors who probably want to invest at times in only green products should be looking at that. A company here called Viridius Capital that's going to be putting a fund together. They're raising money now, and they're using international certifying agency out of New York that certifies 70% of carbon capture projects for World Bank and MDS, MDB, and all the others. We're getting our projects certified as well, so that when you come, say, to invest in one of our green projects, carbon capture or the hydrogen project at Bridgeport, you'll know that it'll have that stamp, that certificate that says what you're getting has international certification. And I think that's going to help everybody unravel this whole concept with COP26. It's going to help everybody unravel, should I be putting my money into saving a rainforest in Borneo, or should I be putting my money into something that's going to capture carbon in the oldest oil field in Queensland, which is PL1 like ours. Yeah. Everybody has a choice, but the whole idea is that the international agencies will start to accredit these carbon credits. And if you don't think carbon credit is a growth industry, Scott Morrison was on before Christmas saying $20 a ton. That's now $50 a ton. His target through last year was $20 a ton maximum. We're now at $50 a ton for Australian carbon credits units. Yeah. And internationally, it's going to be $130 a ton in Canada by 2030. So, that's where people will get the confidence that the money that they put in is going to the right place. And
I think it's all cyclical as well. We, as a generation, the bottom line for me is we have to consume less. When I was growing up, one blender lasted 50
Absolutely.
years.
Buy local, put panels on your roof. I mean, you couldn't do any better than that.
And we don't need 70.
You don't have a choice, unfortunately, with your fuel supply, because that all comes from internationally, mostly here in Australia. It comes from Singapore. So, that comes in on big ships that are distributed through Viva in Geelong or Caltex up in Queensland, WA's Kwinana. They all distribute the refined products that you put in your car. We don't have control on that as an oil and gas producer. We just produce the oil that goes to that refinery. And there's only 3 refineries left in Australia. So Australia's refining capacity has gone to almost zero. It still has that capacity just for security of supply. So you can't do much about where you buy your fuel. Doesn't matter whether you fill up at 7-Eleven, which is Mobil, or fill up at Shell, which is Shell. It's coming from internationally, but you can certainly make a difference by buying local and in my view, putting panels on your roof to help your footprint.
And I also think there's just a really practical tip, which is, do you really need 50,000 pairs of sneakers and We're shipping 17 shampoo bottles. We have a lot of stuff. With COVID, everybody's wanted to kind of nurture and shop online. Do you really need it? We're a very excessive population where we, the other day I got really shocked because someone said, I just want my freedom back. I just want to be able to go to a restaurant. And I understand that concept, and I'm not belittling that, but I feel like we're so lucky. There's so many countries where I don't walk out my front door and I'm not being shot at. I mean, I saw a big kangaroo the other day, but we've lost perspective on suffering. I think we haven't been through the dark times where there was no power for like weeks and months on end. We've never had a big blackout. We're almost a bit spoiled. Please don't give me a hard time if you're listening to this and you think you're there on your high horse, because I'm not. I'm in the same sea that all of you guys are, but I think we consume to fill a gap rather than looking for quality things and getting back in nature with our kids and getting our own veggie gardens going, even if it's just in your windowsill. We've lost our ability to cultivate. So my biggest advice to anyone listening to this would be create before you can consume. Look at what you can reuse. Do you really need all that stuff? How can you streamline and have quality things and be part of the change rather than sitting there throwing shade at organizations that you're still tapping into because you want to go from A to B or your favorite restaurant or everything else? So I don't think there's any ideal perfection. I think we all can do our little bit, whether you're an oil and gas company like yourself, whether you have the capital like BP or BHP or Bridgeport, it's irrelevant. Every bit counts. And instead of jumping on the bandwagon of how terrible everything is, we can start to do one or two things in our own side of the street that contribute to utopia for us all. So, Chris, I really look forward to sharing some show notes about today's episode, the video that we did, which was just a tiny snippet.
Pretty amazing.
There's so much more to share from the footage that we got, and I can't wait to do those little sub-videos around the FDU unit, around the ponds that were once evaporating water supplies that can now go back to livestock.
Well, that's scheduled out in the field in about a month and a half, so that'll be.
Well, get that.
That'll be a watershed moment for us because, it does work. We know it works, but it's always different when you rig it up. It's got electrical standards for Australia now, not US, et cetera. So it's been a pathway to get it there. But like any new technology, the first one's the most expensive, and then I think we'll see the price coming down. I hope that in 2 years, we're doing the first one in Australia. I hope that in 2 years we'll see hundreds of these being rigged up at various oil companies' facilities around. Not that we're selling the product, we're just using it for our own purposes, but I'd like to see that other oil companies doing the right thing with their water. And
I imagine those little FDU units, and I'll put a reference to what this is on the show notes, actually in community areas and in populated areas where we actually have them as sub kind of water distillation units that are powered, and especially in high sunlight areas and everything else. It's not just for a company usage. I think it's for community usage too. It's a great invention, and I can't wait to be out there with my steel toe caps on, cap boots and my high vis.
I'd say hopefully when the weather is improved.
Yeah.
The rain is gone.
Chris Way, CEO and founder of Bridgeport Energy, thank you so much for coming on the show and just giving little snippets of what lies beneath the surface of some really beautiful road milestones to utopia and an integrated approach to energy as a company that's looking at oil, gas, hydrogen, water, everything else, and your CO2 commitment is outstanding. So it's a pleasure to be working with you on these things. If you want information, please leave us a comment. If you've got questions, if we've sparked your interest, we'd love to hear from you. You can find more about Chris Way on LinkedIn, CEO and founder of Bridgeport Energy. You can hop on to bridgeportenergy.net.au. I'll put the links below. And of course, you can also just hit me up on nikkifogden-moore.com. This is Radical Self-Belief, the Mojo Maker podcast. You're listening to episode 162 on the show. We're really pleased and thrilled to be able to have guests with so much intellect, vision, and creativity on board. It's not always easy to run a ship when you don't have a map in front of you, Chris, but you've been doing that with your team for 12 years now, and I feel like this is your time to truly shine in the market, and I hope that we've created a little bit of a spotlight for that. Until next time, listeners and viewers, subscribe, like on YouTube, Vitality Coach TV, on all your podcast platforms. Would love to have you there. I would really appreciate the support, the reviews. And remember, you are the captain of your ship, the driver's seat of your life. You stay healthy, wealthy, and wise. Take care of your side of the street, and hopefully you can take a couple of amazing pieces of information from this episode today that will have you feeling better about how you use energy and the right things are being done behind the scenes. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Like and subscribe on YouTube. And also, we'd love to have you come over and subscribe to Radical Self-Belief, the podcast. We hope you've reignited your vision and showing you how to harness your effortless energy to be the CEO of your business as well as your life.